Following the King's speech at the state opening of Parliament on Wednesday, the Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, hosted a European Political Community Summit at Blenheim Palace. With the exception of the Hungarian leader Viktor Orban, who recently met Vladimir Putin, European leaders put on a show of determination to stand alongside Volodymyr Zelensky, who was also present. But if a newly elected President Trump pulls the plug on US aid to Ukraine, may we soon see Ukraine forced to make peace with Putin, surrendering territory to the aggressor. Will we Europeans be parties to a shameful carve-up, a new Munich? With me now is my panel, the former head of press at Number 10, Giles Kenningham, former Liberal Democrat Minister Norman Baker, and former Labour Minister Bill Rammell. Before we turn to the Munich question, Norman, Keir Starmer is trying to get closer to Europe again. What is the space that he has to get closer to Europe? He's not going to rejoin the European Union. What does he dare to do? How close can he go?
Very little, I'm afraid. He's ruled out a whole range of things before the election, including the single market and the customs union. There's not much left, and the European Union is not going to bend over backwards to say, have all these things and we'll take nothing in return. It isn't going to happen. So you might get some deal with some students attending universities in the European Union countries. He might get some tweaking of trade rules affecting agricultural goods or whatever, but it's going to be nothing very much at all. And I think he's missed a trick because I think the British public was ready to go slightly further than he is. The vote for, of course, to leave the European Union was 52-48, but a lot of people who voted to leave actually wanted a closer relationship than the one that finally emerged. They wanted us still to be in the single market, for example, as Mrs Thatcher famously did in the 1980s. So I think he's shut off some doors unnecessarily, and he's got no room for manoeuvre.
Interesting. Bill, what do you make of that assessment? And in particular, do you think there's more room than Norman is saying?
I think there is room for manoeuvre. The centrepiece is going to be defence and security cooperation, leveraging Britain's position as a global security superpower to win us friends and influence within the European Union. I think that will come in the field of migration, where we've got a mutual interest in tackling the problem. I think that can get us a better returns agreement with the European Union, practical access to the remit of the Dublin Convention, so we can return people to first country of entry. I think there are possibilities around mutual recognition of professional qualifications, the chemicals industry, where I think we can get a better deal, and agriculture. So I think there is room for manoeuvre. Personally, I think Brexit is the biggest act of national self-harm we've ever inflicted on ourselves as a nation. And this is where I differ with Norman, it is a reality. There is no going back. We couldn't countenance that. I think people would be
electorally.
Yeah, electorally, given the referendum result. But we can get closer. We can get closer alignment where it's in both our interest and the European Union's interests. And I think that is what Keir is targeting. And, the reaction and the mood music from fellow European governments this week was extremely positive.
Giles, Norman makes the point that the European Union partners would want something in return for anything that we are given. Now, for example, on migration, if we're to have more illegal migrants return to the continent, they will probably require us to participate in some sort of burden sharing with the European Union. Can you imagine that going down well with the British people? An announcement that we have to accept X thousands of people, not who'd arrived on these shores, but because we're part of a deal with European partners.
No, and let's be clear, Starmer's got no mandate for this. He's ruled out going back into the customs union. He's ruled out the single market. He's ruled out another referendum, although previously he has advocated for this and he's flip-flop. But no, he's got no mandate for this. So I think, to Bill's point, I do agree that on issues of defence and security, it seems eminently sensible, given the level of volatility in the world, for some form of cooperation. I don't think we need to oppose them just for the sake of opposing them, and we should have a constructive relationship. But anything moving towards what we previously had is just not pragmatic or possible, and he hasn't got the mandate for it.
Norman, it was a particular moment. Keir Starmer had recently been elected. There was a fantastic attendance from European nations, well beyond the European Union. Everyone, as I say, with the exception of Viktor Orban from Hungary, was there alongside Volodymyr Zelensky. But my goodness, the reckoning is coming soon, isn't it? Because if Trump wins the presidency in November, his policy on Ukraine will be completely different. I gave to you this scenario that we might need to be, as Europeans, parties to a new Munich agreement. How do you feel about that?
Well, very reluctant, and I imagine most people in this country do, especially with the effort we've made to support Ukraine. I mean, the reality is that Ukraine is suffering tremendous losses in terms of people, in terms of infrastructure, everything else, really, way of life. But so are the Russians. The Russians are suffering huge losses in manpower. They're also burning through their Soviet-era tanks and other artillery at a rate of knots. They haven't got very much left. And I think both sides are just hanging on in this kind of no man's land almost until they get to the American election to see what happens. My guess is if Trump is elected, then there will be an isolationist strand from the US, and the Europeans will have to make their mind up at that point whether they're going to redouble efforts and with more cost to support Ukraine, or have to accept the reality of what you suggested, which is some sort of dreadful Munich agreement. On the other hand, if the Democrats can somehow pull themselves together, then Russia may take the view at that stage that they've got 4 years of American president who's not on their side, and then they would be willing to come to the table at that stage.
Bill, what's your reaction? Am I exaggerating when I talk about a new Munich? In particular, I'm referring to the sense of shame that we may feel if once more the great powers tell an invaded country that it must settle with the aggressor.
That would be a huge shame, and I really hope that we don't get there. Look, I'm not going to deny that I think Donald Trump presents real risks to NATO, to global security and to the future of Ukraine. However, if you look to his last period, I desperately hope even at this stage that the Democrats can pull themselves together. Joe steps down as the candidate and we get a better candidate, better able to beat Trump. But, you know, if it comes to Trump, look at his record the last time he was in power. The actions didn't always match the rhetoric. And what's going to be critical, if that does come to pass, is that Europe, with Canada, with Australia, with the UK leveraging its global security position, is absolutely steadfast in support for Ukraine, support for NATO, and hopefully prevailing in the discussions that take place with the Trump administration. But there are risks.
Giles, I think, as it were, rhetorically, we're going to remain, robust and alongside Ukraine. But it isn't about rhetoric, it's about munitions. Yeah. And the Europeans don't have the munitions if the Americans decide to step aside. How do you view what's coming down the track for us here?
I think it could be existential. I think the US...
Existential for who?
Well, I think for NATO, because the US, I think it contributes 16% of the total budget. Trump has already said, look, it's too much. Other European and other nations need to step up to the plate. They have increased spending gradually over the past 10 years. But you can see, to Bill's point, they are going to, it seems like, if Trump gets in, follow this very isolationist policy, not just in relation to NATO, but you've seen Trump talk about Taiwan as well, where he said, look, it's 9,500 miles away from the USA. It's only 65 miles away from China. You can see them pulling back the drawbridge. I think for the global order, it does pose a very big question. And to your point, the nations do need to step up to the plate.
Norman, it's all very well blaming Donald Trump. We should blame ourselves. We put ourselves in this position. We're not able to defend Europe without the United States. And here we are now bleating because Donald Trump may withdraw the funding.
Well, the one thing I'd agree with Trump on is that the Europeans over the last 2-3 decades ought to produce more money for themselves in terms of their defence. It's not been sensible to expect American soldiers to be based entirely in Germany or wherever they are to defend ourselves. So that's an historical problem. We are where we are now. And the problem with the isolation approach from Trump, and J.D. Vance, by the way, who's Trump with bells on, actually, is we're going to end up with not just a problem with Ukraine, but as actually Giles said, with Taiwan. Because, the Chinese see the red light at the moment from the Americans not to go to Taiwan. If Trump changes that, they could invade Taiwan. What will the Americans do about it then? Nothing. So we'll end up with a whole range of international problems as a consequence of the isolation proposals from Trump.
Bill, very briefly, if I recall, you were Armed Forces Minister. Were you not frustrated, firstly, that we weren't spending enough on defence, but secondly, that the money that we spent on defence we spent so badly?
Particularly that latter point, and under successive governments, the Ministry of Defence's track record on procurement and management of its finances is frankly shocking. And I've got the highest regard for military leaders in their military roles. They're actually fairly hopeless managers when it comes to managing the defence budget, and we need to tackle that. But we also need Europe to be united to push back if there is a Trump presidency and tackle that problem.